Recently, the Federal Reserve has been getting friendly with inflation and wants to get you comfortable with it as well. Hi, I'm Brooke Thackeray. Welcome to my rant. The Federal Reserve governors have all had the same speech recently in public. Inflation is low. Inflation needs to go higher. Inflation is good for the economy. And if inflation does occur, it'll only be transitory as the economy is reopening. And in case it becomes a problem in the future, don't worry, we've got the tools to deal with it. I'm not buying it. In 2020, the broad money, and broad money is defined as the amount of money in the economy versus base money in the financial system, the broad money in the US in 2020 was increased by 25%. That's a huge amount. It's difficult to say that there won't be any negative consequences from this down the road. Now, inflation hasn't been going up. Well, we've been going through the COVID-19 pandemic, so we've seen decreased demand, and the velocity of money has been falling as well. The velocity of money is defined as the amount of times that money turns over in an economy per year. But at some point, the velocity of money will increase. Maybe it's a year out, maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's 3 years. We don't know. But at some point, it'll increase. And that's when we could start to have some problems. The Fed goes, don't worry, we got it covered. We've got tools to deal with this. Of course, what would you expect them to say? But anyhow. So what's the standard way of actually looking after inflation that's rising? It's to raise interest rates on a sustained basis in order to curtail inflation expectations. I'm not sure that's on the table this time around. You've got record government debt. You've got monstrous personal debt and huge corporate debt. Raising interest rates on a sustained basis would absolutely crush the economy. So that one is not, I don't think, a serious consideration. Okay, so maybe the government could take over. They could raise taxes. Raising taxes at this time probably wouldn't work as well because, first of all, the tax rates in the Western world are extremely high, and there's huge debt, which does not make this an attractive solution. Okay, so maybe the government could come up with a different solution. That's to enter into wage and price controls. Now, this has not been a solution talked about for a long time because we haven't had inflation problems. But many countries around the world over the years have tried wage and price controls. And each government has come along as always say, oh, we're going to do it differently. We're going to do it temporarily. We're only going to target certain sectors of the economy. And every single time, it's been a disaster. So wage and price controls really, despite what every government that institutes them says, they're always a disaster. So that's not on the table. But I will say that the Fed is being a little bit sneaky here, and they've been recently increasing their buying of TIPS, the Treasury Inflation Protected Bonds of the government, or notes of the government, which pay investors a real yield. Now, before the pandemic, they owned less than 10% of the TIP market. Now, they own 20% of the TIP market. And buying TIPS decreases their yield, which increases the inflation expectations in the economy. Now, so why would they be doing this? I don't get it. Well, I do a little bit, but I get why they're buying nominal bonds through the pandemic, because they want to lower interest rates to encourage consumers to borrow and spend, and companies to borrow and spend as well. I get why they're buying mortgage-backed securities, because that's going to help lower mortgage rates to help the economy. But TIPS has nothing to do with any of that. The only thing that it helps when you buy TIPS is to drive up the expectation of inflation in the future, because that's how a lot of investors actually measure. They measure inflation expectations through TIPS. So here's what I think they're doing. I think they're buying the TIPS, increasing the amount of TIPS they have. So if inflation expectations do become too high in the future, they can then sell the TIPS into the market and then drive down the inflation expectations. It's a small tool. It wouldn't solve the whole thing, but I think it's one of the reasons why they're doing this. Overall, I think they don't have a lot of tools to solve an inflation problem down the road that could occur. Right now, inflation is not a problem in our economy. In fact, we may actually go through a period of disinflation or even deflation as we try to struggle with getting the economy going out of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's totally possible. But longer term, I think inflation could become a problem. I think the Federal Reserve is trying to get everybody comfortable with inflation. That 2% or 3% or even 4% is not a bad thing. I think they're trying to change the narrative to say that, worrying about inflation is old school economics. That's not the way it's done anymore. And then don't worry, if things get out of hand down the road, we have the situation under control. I don't buy into it. I think there is going to be a bit of a problem. But I think the problem is going to be that investors are slowly going to be lulled into inflation's not a problem. It's a little bit like the frog in the pot of boiling water. The frog goes into the pot and the temperature slowly turned up, and eventually the frog meets its demise. I think then investors are going to be the same, or they're going to slowly get accustomed to rising inflation and not see this as being a big deal. But eventually it could be a big deal. Anyhow, something to watch out for in the future. Thank you very much for joining me today.